Okay. Next up, we have Paul Ferguson from Trend Micro, speaking on law enforcement engagement and incident response handling. Control L.
Thanks. That sounds a lot more impressive than what it actually is. Anyway, I'm Paul Ferguson. I work for Trend Micro, and I wear a couple of different hats, but one of them is a lot of outreach to law enforcement and non-governmental organizations, as well as the ISP community. But before I start into this, let me preface this with a couple of items here, just so let you know what this is not. So this is not really geared towards what I would consider to be strictly the ISPs that are just bit shippers. They just pick up the bits on one side and spit them out on the other. However, they're orthogonally related because some of these issues will probably overlap into their area of responsibility. So these are really not issues that I don't think are currently handled by like NSPSec or inter-NOC communications for those who participate in things like INOC DBA, although that's a good segue that lead in presentation. This is actually a subset of some slides that I'm working on to put together for the next anti-phishing working group counter e-crime summit in Tokyo in late May. So I'm basically, the North American region is not necessarily one where we're really having a lot of problems, although there are problems there, just trying to contact people and let them know that they actually have a problem. The real problem is outside the United States, mostly in Europe and a lot in Asia and other parts of the world where the contact information for the responsible parties for a particular incident is either incorrect or outdated, but I'll get to that. Let's see. So let's see. What's the problem? We don't really have things like code red outbreaks and virus outbreaks like we use, and worm outbreaks like we used to do. Now, basically, it's all financially motivated. And basically, the predominant threats that ISPs may consider is against their infrastructure, and rightly so, because that's where most of all your money is going. But for the most part, a lot of these type of criminals aren't going after the infrastructure with denial of service attacks. They'd like to keep the infrastructure in place because any disruption in the connectivity, puts an air gap between them and their victims and their ability to gain money. So the only time that we're really seeing DDoSes, and people from Arbor, Danny, and someone else can back this up, most of the time is when somebody pisses these guys off, or it's an international a hacktivist type of incident, or somebody in a security company is taking money out of their pocket and they just DDoS them off the face of the earth. So most of the time, these guys are basically just for financially profit motive, and the sophistication and the level and just the sheer volume of the website and web server compromises that we're seeing these days is enough to boggle the mind. And in fact, just here recently, we had a very large one in the UK that was geared. And these aren't just necessarily just Windows user issues. A lot of these are now going to a Mac and Mac OS X, and on the server side, a lot of the Linux hosting platforms are getting compromised, and these hosting facilities, and injecting individual HTML injection with malicious JavaScript and iframe redirects to third-party hosts located elsewhere that actually contain these exploit engines. So what we're seeing is literally thousands, and sometimes even hundreds of thousands of websites, web pages that are leading to even, an order of magnitude of larger number of compromised users and basically unwitting botnet zombies. And basically botnets, contrary to popular belief, aren't just used for DDoSes. They're also rented out in other criminal endeavors. They're used for spamming. They're used for financial fraud and things of that nature, click fraud. This is the subtitle of this presentation could be more or less like lessons learned. These are some of the issues that we're seeing in the security community that we're trying to overcome. And it leaves basically for those of us to try to go and notify the victims, because notifying the user is coming at the problem from a completely different angle, which is already happening too, by its own inertia. But we also have, how do we contact these hosting providers? How do we contact the owners of the IP address spaces, the domains, and regional contacts? And there are frameworks in place to address that. But I sent an email out to the list last night. I don't know how many people saw it. It was basically prefacing a couple of things that I was going to put in here, but I'd already submitted my slides and I didn't get a chance to do so. There's a couple of really good studies that came out that reinforce some of the things that we're seeing. One of them is the fact that we're seeing a large rise in malicious, rogue, or misconfigured DNS resolvers. Some of them are sitting on infected botnet hosts on residential DSL machines that have been compromised. They're opening as open resolvers. They'll resolve anything. And from their sample set of hosts that they investigated, they were either incorrect or surely malicious. They found a sample of their sample set of several hundred thousand. They found 2.4% of all the DNS resolvers were either misconfigured or malicious. And if you could extrapolate that to all the DNS resolvers on the internet, that's something in the neighborhood of like 300,000 open DNS resolvers. So, and the other study was Google analyzing billions of URLs and found 3 million unique URLs on 180,000 websites that were malicious or led to malicious content. So what we have here is the threat vector now is moving into the web. We used to be able to tell people that when there was a vulnerability that came out in an operating system or in a browser or in a third-party application and there wasn't a patch for it yet, the standard advice used to be, well, make sure you patch, run antivirus, yada, 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 and don't surf to the bad side of the internet. Well, I mean, that kind of advice doesn't really hold water anymore because even trusted websites now are falling victim, because what we see is we have, even here in California, we've had several incidents of local county governments who don't have an IT staff and no budget for one, who outsource the maintenance of their public-facing web pages to a third party. And some consultant will come in, put up a website for them, and collect their money and go on their way. And if there's ever a vulnerability that's found in, say, like, Apache or cPanel or IIS or whatever, there's nobody ever around to come back and patch it. And basically you've got, hordes of bad guys out there. They're scanning vast numbers of IP blocks all the time, just looking for the specific thing. And that's how they get their foothold in. And somebody, in, say, Santa Clara County, going to look on the bus schedule on the VTA on a website, and they haven't been doing due diligence to make sure that every patch and every application had been patched, finds himself unwittingly now putting their confidential information into the hands of some criminal on the other side of the planet. That's kind of the scope of the problem, and I'm not really overstating it. So primarily as a security company, our first goal is to integrate the threat notifications into our products. That's our first goal. The second one, of course, well, before I get to that, which means that we have a large staff of quote-unquote researchers who are doing nothing but deploying honeypots, sandboxes, reverse engineering malware, malicious JavaScript, doing AV signatures. We're doing IP reputation because we owned the old RBL Plus that used to belong to Maps. We've built domain reputation system that we're trying to find fast flux botnet people who are trying to hide. So we're integrating all this in the cloud stuff, not into down on the client side anymore. We're doing it in the cloud as references for known malicious URLs and things, because they're quicker to implement and it keeps the code size small on the clients. But we also have browser plugins and things like that. I think that's kind of the way the industry is going, because we don't really define the direction that we go. The bad guys do it for us. And so we're trying to implement all that stuff into our product base. And we're also trying to, at the same time, notify the owners of compromised websites to remove malicious content and shrink that time to compromise window down from the time a vulnerability is exploited and the time that it's cleaned up or patched or removed down as far as we can, because the longer that window is open, the larger percentage and possibility of users who could get exploited to that compromise. And basically the sheer volume sometimes, how do you notify the owners of 70,000 compromised web pages? Well, that's impossible. So this is some of the issues that we've dealt with over the course of the past couple of years. The second goal is to find the criminals behind this stuff. And that's sometimes a little harder to do because of their, There are geopolitical issues at work here. There are international extradition and evidentiary things that have to be adhered to, and that doesn't work a lot. But actually, in the past couple of years, I've actually worked with FBI cybercrime and the Secret Service to actually track down a couple of individuals on the other side of the planet and provide them forensic evidence to them, and the status of that investigation is ongoing. Bad guys make mistakes sometimes. Which means that, we have a few staff researchers dedicated to working with law enforcement and working with the national certs and the CSERTs and working with the ISP community, the hosting communities, the registries, the registrars, and basically when you're having to reach out and touch each individual organization through the normal channels, things massively fall through the cracks. So, for instance, how many times have you tried to notify somebody at an abuse desk, abuse at domain contact, and it fall into a black hole never to be heard of again? Well, these are the type of issues that we're talking about, which basically falls into a black hole, or on the other side, when it actually works, they've got an automated response system where they automatically generate a ticket number and a phone number so that you can call and check on the status of a ticket. Those are the very few and far between good times. So, but one of the things here is I'm trying to use the language of what this really is. I'm not trying to dumb down, because a lot of people call, hackers, crackers, malware, miscreants. No, this is criminal activity. We're seeing vast amounts of stolen credit card information being moved daily in underground IRC forums, very high sophisticated and organized money mule activity, moving money from accounts to accounts across international borders, using everything from MoneyGram to Western Union to Xboxes. So in the future, we need to stop, dumbing down the language when we're talking about this stuff, because it's crime. So some of the activity we're seeing now is actually organized crime. And I don't remember who it was, but somebody in the IETF, or maybe I forget who it was, that said that the measure of success of the internet is when things that happen out here in the real world move into the digital world. Basically, you can declare success. The same holds true for crime. The same scams that have held true since the beginning of human history have now moved into the digital world. So, make no mistake, the criminals follow the money. It's all financial enterprise now, and we can expect much more of the same in the near future. I was a little irritated with the IETF and the Internet Architecture Board for having a workshop and dumbing down the language of what they call unwanted traffic on the internet. I understand what they were trying to get at, but a lot of this unwanted traffic is primarily backscatter from criminal activity, whether it's spam, backscatter spam, malicious DNS probing, in-map scanning of IP address blocks, brute force attacks, whatever. But generally, the thing is, most of this crime is happening not through very resource-intensive methods of like in-map scanning and brute force attacks, brute force SSH stuff. That's too difficult. There's enough low-hanging fruit out there to make this a multi-million-dollar a year enterprise for these criminals. It's getting much more clever, much more convoluted, and it's, a lot of these guys are basically operating in the open without any fear of being prosecuted or tracked down whatsoever. So it's a little altruistic on my part, but sometimes it just really kind of gets under my skin how these guys manage to just use the same registration systems, the same technology, the same infrastructure, the same processes and policies that people who do it, for fun, games, or business in the legitimate sense can also game these same systems for criminal purposes. So the goal and the desired results of this is kind of a lesson learned, is like try to engage the community for some better two-way communications for all the stakeholders involved. That includes law enforcement, which in the United States is FBI, Cybercrime Division, Secret Service, Department of Treasury, because especially this time of year we're seeing lots of IRS phishing and scams and that nature. Like, hey, hello, you've got an IRS refund. Please click here. Department of Homeland Security. And also in Europe, for instance, Scotland Yard, the London Met, and other similar law enforcement organizations around the world. And again, I say, the United States, pretty much we've been pretty successful in using private contacts and private communications and leveraging those relationships to working out process of knowing who to reach out and touch about a specific incident. So United States and the North American marketplace, pretty much, as far as cybercrime is concerned, it's coming along fairly well. But we also need to burn this candle from the top down too. We need to engage non-governmental organizations, which are basically CERTs, regional CERTs, the registries and the registrars. I forget, at last count, there were like 700 or 800 registrars globally now that were ICANN accredited. I forget exactly, but the regional internet registries themselves, network operations forums to include like Apricot, RIPE, NANOG, the financial institutions, because I'm not talking about Visa or MasterCard here because they're basically just the network providers for the banks and the merchants. Those are the two entities right there, the banks and the merchants, who are basically underwriting the liability on the fraud losses. And if anybody hasn't been keeping up with the news, one of the reasons right now why there hasn't been a real backlash against this type of behavior is because if you notice a fraudulent charge in your credit card for a couple $100, what do? You go to your bank and say, hey, there's a fraudulent charge on my credit card for a couple $100. They launch an investigation, a few weeks later, you get it credited back to your account. No problem. You get a new card, you're back in business. So therefore, you're not incentivized really to change your behavior. That's starting to change slightly, and maybe not in the United States because of consumer protection laws, but in New Zealand, the banking industry there is already looking at making the consumer more liable for those fraud losses. In fact, there's a proposal right now that they're going to render a decision about by the end of this month that the banks may withhold the right to examine your local PC if you've had any financial fraud reported against your credit card or debit card or whatever by your bank. They reserve the right to examine and make sure you've had the latest patches installed, running the latest antivirus and stuff, and if you haven't, you may be out of money. So when those type of fraud, those liabilities start changing, maybe we'll see a little bit more, but right now, we have to work the systems we have. So what we're trying to do is leverage these existing infrastructures to be able to reach out and expand, to not necessarily work the consumer angle, because that's already happening from a lot of different perspectives. We're trying to work with the people who are kind of like the unwitting middleman between the criminal and the unwitting victim. And that's most of the time it's hosting facilities, corporations themselves that have public-facing web content that gets compromised, that act as basically the enterprise for the criminals. So we're develop operational processes to engage and communicate with these organizations, exchange intelligence in semi and real time, and again, not NSPSEC. So we'll break that down a little bit. Okay, so for law enforcement, we need more focus and relationship with international law enforcement and even with U.S. local and regional law enforcement. One of the problems that I've had locally, and across the United States is I've had a real close working relationship with a couple of FBI cybercrime agents in the San Francisco Bay Area that I've been working with. And out of the 5 that were working out of the San Francisco Bay Area office, 3 of them actually have been reassigned to work on counterterror. So, their resources are being reassigned, and that's being driven by a larger agenda elsewhere. So what happens is a lot of times more and more law enforcement is coming to us in private industry asking for our assistance. I'm not talking about spying on customers or warrantless wiretaps and stuff like that. I'm talking about, they want us to help them find these criminals working out of Eastern Europe and out of Asia and South America and stuff that are banging on the doors of corporations and consumers and launching these scams and the malicious compromises and things like that, and bilking people out of their hard-earned money. So we're trying to develop mechanisms for reporting cybercrime, that also engages the ISPs that there may be some overlap into your backyard. And you may not want to know about it. I know when I worked at the ISP, and even when I was working with ISPs when I worked at Cisco, most of the time, I was just a router jockey. We pick the bits up on one end of the pipe and we spit them out on the other, and we don't really care whether they're good bits or evil bits. Well, unfortunately, we're kind of at like a juncture right now that if we don't kind of help police ourselves, somebody else is going to force us to police it, and it may be something that we're saddled with that we don't like. It's already starting to happen with like peer-to-peer file sharing. So, word to the wise. So we're also involved heavily in mutual investigation exchanges with other researchers from other security companies, networking companies, and things like that. And we're looking for ways to actively engage, all the participants here. And for non-government organizations, we already have some piecemeal working relationships with some certs around the world, but we found the best amount of success using the first accredited membership organizations of certs and CCerts around the world. Some are more responsive than others, but like US CERT, JP CERT. I had some success a couple weeks ago in Thailand. One of the websites of a major Thai national broadcast company was compromised serving up malicious content. It's happened in India where a major bank website was compromised. And how many millions of people could have been exposed to that? We try to contact the content owners first. When they don't respond within a reasonable time, we try to contact the people who own the IP, the technical admins for the IP technical contacts. If that doesn't work, we try to contact the CERT in that. And sometimes we do all these simultaneously. Sometimes if that doesn't happen, because basically now that window, the time to exploit window is growing, the last resort is to publicize the issue. And that usually nobody actually ever really wins, and that happens because somebody ends up looking bad in the public eye instead of like doing the right thing, trying to protect the consumers. So we're also trying to actively engage anybody that does financial transactions, e-commerce, banks, eBay, PayPal, Visa. So the first.org contact list works. Use it. We've had an enormous success working with FIRST and their members. ISP and operations engagement, which is kind of like one of the reasons why I'm here to engage this community. I mean, it's not an easy path because security is very hard, because security to people depends on who you're talking to and about what topic. And for ISPs, every ISP is a one-off. Every ISP likes to do things their way. And that's their business decision. There's no ISP police, thank goodness. But I mean, there's a couple best current practice. Actually, they're not best current practices, I don't think, but there are a couple of RFCs here that should be noted. That's mailbox names for common service roles and functions, and this is where the abuse at or help desk at mailboxes come in handy, or admin at, or webmaster at. Because sometimes there's a web page, they'll have contact information embedded on the web page, please contact webmaster at, and 10 seconds later you get a bounce email. And recommended internet service provider security services and procedures, RC 3013. And unfortunately, not all service providers follow or are even aware of some of these guidelines. So we're also trying to develop a relationship with corporate abuse and fraud contacts too. It's an ongoing effort, lots of challenges. Need to develop a process to immediately interact with these organizations, and we're working on it. The biggest challenge is internal process. It's not just process, but discipline. It's like doing the same thing every time, but it's very hard because what we found is that, we used to be able to rely on WHOIS information for technical contacts, but, there's two different issues here. We found the domain portion of the WHOIS registry is completely unreliable for the most part. It might be correct for people who are good actors, but it may be completely incorrect for those who are bad actors. There's no check mechanism there to keep bad actors from abusing that. The only real good information there is the name server information, and you can track that historically as a passive DNS or passive aggressive DNS type of back-end automated system. But trying to find technical contacts for who owns those domains, forget about it. What we found with the RIR side, the IP allocation side of the WHOIS database, is generally pretty accurate, because basically what we're dealing with here is allocation information. And at least within ARIN policies, if you sub-allocate, you're required to SWIP it. Well, I don't know if require is the right word, right? You're encouraged to. I think most of the RIPE allocations or sub-allocations are encouraged to do the same thing. So generally, the technical contacts for the IP address space are pretty good, but they might not be the same people who administer those web pages, that content. So usually we end up having to work this escalation path through the various ways of trying to find people responsible for the content. And I think NANOG is in a very uniquely positioned in a very unique position to influence behavior here. Because, I mean, there's been several discussions on the NANOG mailing list about like having like quote-unquote NANOG best current practices. And there were some people in favor of those type of things, and some people are not quite in favor of it. And maybe that's something that maybe I'll pick discussion back up on again if that's within the framework of NANOG. That's for you to decide. I know that RIPE does it. RIPE has working groups actually for routing and security and things of that nature. It may not be a right fit for NANOG, but I mean at least it would be something to consider. Because, I mean, if we don't find some kind of way to process and communicate with the stakeholders in this, we're already behind the bad guys as it is. There's more of them. There's more money in it for them. And we're just basically trying to dog paddle and stay afloat, basically, to mitigate the threats on an ongoing basis. So summary, I mean, we're kind of like on the right path, but there's been lots of course corrections. And when it comes to like communicating from us, who basically what we're doing is we're seeing the threats in real time, or semi-real time, compromised. We're running across like, the same embedded malicious JavaScript that points to some compromised server in, say China or Brazil, whatever, on 10,000 web pages across the internet. What we're trying to do is trying to figure out some way to notify the appropriate people to help get that cleaned up, because there are some that are out there. You can go out there right now and look on any, there are lots of .gov and .edu, which, so that's sometimes a swamp as it is, but websites that are hosting links to everything from child porn to fake Canadian pharmacy sites to actually malicious code. And it's a cesspool. And the problem, I think, is a lot larger than most folks in this room give credence to. So there's a larger effort that needs to be taken here, and NANOG community needs to act as one voice. And I'd like to be able to engage the NANOG community from time to time. But what I really would like to do is solicit some comments. If you think this is a worthwhile endeavor for members of the NANOG community to engage in, or would you rather punt on the issue and let the people who are the victims and the web hosting providers themselves, who actually come to NANOG too on occasion, deal with it as it may be. So, I mean, at that, I'd like to kind of solicit any comments at the microphone. I mean, there's a comment today, right before I came up to the microphone, where we had some reports of some political website instability today. It's a big primary day in Wisconsin. So,
You're certified. The term bulletproof hosting is a red flag.
I wasn't going to mention any names or point out any specific thing. I was trying to be as non-controversial as possible here, but I'm happy for someone else to bring it up.
You said that the problem is largely outside US, but I can name at the moment about 5 ASs in the US that I consider totally black for me in my scale. And I'm really wondering why they are allowed to be operated in this country.
This is a topic that's come up on several occasions with people that are actually in this room that work at ISPs, that's happened over the course of the past at least a year. That we've engaged, I'm not saying we, me, myself, and I, and Trim, but also been part of these discussions on specific ASs and very specific prefixes that are known bad actors. Why they were still allowed to even advertise routes on the internet. And it continued and continued and continued until they decided to withdraw them themselves and diversify their operations into other shadier corners of the internet. They're still there. They're just now diversified. So I don't know the answer to that. This community is in charge of that. And I have a feeling we'll hear some reasoning along the lines of, our policy is that we don't black hole route entire blocks of address space because of foo or whatever. But, I don't know the answer to that question. Don, I see you. Are you at the microphone?
I'm in front of Don first. Mike Calder with Cisco Systems. You had asked for some suggestions on contacts and whatnot. One of the suggestions that came out of the National Infrastructure Advisory Committee, the NIAC, several years ago was actually the idea of a /security page on a website that would give you information on how to contact the various contacts at a company when you do need some incident response support. And then, that would go for ISPs and even customers of ISPs. Certainly, I think it's a good idea to advise your customers, put up a /security page that says if you've got abuse going on with your domain, here's a great way of contacting them, because we all know that root and postmaster mail goes unanswered at most places.
It just goes into a black hole. So basically my frustrations is to try to do due diligence to try to contact the people to get them to clean up their mess. And some people are just ignorant of the fact, or apathetic of the fact, or either just there's no contact information for them. The General Services Administration almost pulled the entire domain authority for ca.gov earlier last year over one particular incident in one county government website that was compromised in California. Luckily, somebody got to them and stopped them from doing that, but it would have basically crippled all domain resolution for ca.gov because of the instance. So there's some ignorance there too. But what's really lacking is process. Myself and several other people in the security community tried for several times to contact them. We sent email to the people there, and the kind of funny thing about it is the person who was responsible for it thought it was a phishing email. We tried to explain to them they had a security problem. They said if they thought it was a phishing, they deleted it. So we picked up the telephone and called them too. They feigned ignorance.
Question?
Yes, just want to make a quick point. In the beginning of the talk, you mentioned port scanning being a bad activity, and anything that is bad activity should be called criminal. Wanted to make a point that port scanning isn't actually criminal, and contrast this with copyright infringement, which is by definition criminal. How come we are really so concerned about port scanning so much and not copyright infringement, which is a organized crime? Not that I agree with this, but I want to make a point that criminality of things does not necessarily imply that causality of things.
Well, not to pick at nits, but not necessarily the act of port scanning. Everybody should know the internet is a very noisy place, and they should know the best current practices to protect them from that noise. But it's not necessarily just active port scanning, but it's just like vulnerability scanning, and then exploiting those vulnerabilities. That could be considered a criminal act depending on the law of that particular jurisdiction.
We have had convictions in Finland of people port scanning a bank.
Much like the
Attempted
the
malicious use
Move
of
on.
these
Next one.
systems.
We're running out of time here, so.
Okay, so only questions from people at the microphones now. Is that okay? No. All right, 13 minutes. I'd be happy to talk to anybody later in the hallway. Thank you.